Welcome to this podcast of the Apologist bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. Let's take a look at a book called Bruce and Stan's Guide to How It All Began, and they call it a user-friendly approach. They have some questions on the front cover. Where did we come from? Was there a plan? Is there proof? And we've done, I think, two podcasts in the past. And so I wanted to look at one of their chapters here called Faith, Not Just a Religious Thing. So it comes, it's chapter 10, so it's probably 4/5 of the book into the book, which is fine because what they've been doing up till then is talking about things like Big Bang and the way the earth is designed for life. It appears to be designed for life, and how hard it is to get the origin of life going to get life here, and the human beings, where did we come from? Are we just one more animal or whatever? So they've been talking about the creation of the universe and the earth and people. And now this chapter is, which I think is a good place to put this, it's about faith. It's kind of like summing up all this information that they've given so far. And they said they want to cover four main things, especially. Are faith and intellect mutually exclusive? God requires faith, but Darwin does too. What are you going to take, little steps or gigantic leaps? And number 4, what's the real hang-up? So they give you a summary at the beginning of the things I just mentioned, covering the start of the universe, the start of life, the human race, and things like that. So they said, all right, the Darwinists, the people who believe in evolution, say that, well, let's not get into intelligent design, right? Because they said that theory implies the existence of an intelligent designer. Well, that's true, it does, doesn't it? And the Darwinists will say the phrase intelligent designer is just a name for God. Yeah, that's probably true as well. Third point the Darwinists will bring up, belief in God requires faith. Well, nobody's going to argue with that either. And here comes the part that these two authors, that's Bruce Bickle and Stan Jantz, here's the fourth point that they are going to argue with. Faith is all about religion. Religion is anti-intellectual and has no role in science. And they said, oh, too bad, they blew it right at the end. All right, so here are the 4 steps that the Darwinists are going to go with. Intelligent design seems to call for an intelligent designer. That would be God. How do you believe in God? That takes faith. Faith is connected to religion, and religion is anti-intellectual, has no role. Okay, they said that's not being unfair to the Darwinists. For example, they quote George Smith, an atheist. He says, Christian theism must be rejected by any person with even a shred of respect for reason. And then here's the American Civil Liberties Union. ACLU also opposes the inculcation of religious doctrines, even if they're presented as alternatives to scientific theories. Creation science in all guises, for example, abrupt appearance theory or intelligent design theory is just such religious doctrine. So do you see what they're doing here? These people, these Darwinists, are saying that belief in God requires a step of faith because we really don't have physical evidence for this God. And they equate faith with religion. So then they reject the whole God notion at the outset. They say, oh, religion doesn't have anything to do with science. We're going to say that the universe is like a closed box, nothing from the outside, no God's hand getting involved. So it's a closed box. And anything that suggests religion is not science. Science is that closed box. Well, these two authors say, well, wait a minute. Is faith at odds with science? Should intelligent design theory be rejected just because belief in God requires an element of faith? What about Darwinism? Isn't some faith in that theory required if there's not adequate evidence for it? And then if faith is required for belief in both intelligent design theory and Darwinism, which is the greater stretch? In other words, which takes more faith? So I think those are excellent questions. So they start in, then obviously you got to talk about what faith is and what it isn't. Said if you go to the dictionary, you'll hear something like unquestioning belief in God and religious tenets. But they said, well, that's not the kind of faith that seems to be connected with intelligent design. There doesn't have to be anything super spiritual about the definition of faith. You can use it in a non-religious context. In fact, again, the dictionary will say faith can also mean confidence, trust, or reliance on something or some person. Now, let's take a look at it from that definition. That's what they're going to look at next. Faith, according to that, requires some kind of evidence of reliability. So they give an example. So you've got a chair at your dining room table, and you've sat in that chair a whole bunch of times before, so you have evidence it's reliable. So you have faith that you're going to come in and sit down and it's not going to collapse under you, right? So faith requires some evidence of reliability. Faith doesn't involve the disengagement of your brain. Said you wouldn't walk into a room blindfolded and just sit anywhere with the faith that the chair would just magically appear between you and the floor. That's not faith, that's stupidity. Then they say, Darwinists are correct. A belief in God does require faith. But then they imply that faith requires a suspension of rational thought, which of course turns everybody who believes in the Bible, it makes them out to be a lunatic, right? Illogical. So yeah, I think that's the view that the scientific community has, the one that's hostile to Christianity. But they said, God requires faith that involves your mind, your spirit, and your heart. And so they break those three things down. Knowledge, trust, and heart would be will. So let's go through those three. God wants a faith that has knowledge, trust, and will. So let's start with the first one, knowledge. Faith is an unwavering belief in God, not an unquestioning belief, right? So asking questions is part of that faith. In the case of that chair, where is it? How is it put together? Has it held people like me in the past? So knowledge is a necessary part of faith. And then there's trust. The Bible, it means much more than mere confidence in knowing something. Like, I'm sure that chair won't collapse when I sit on it. What do? It moves from your mind to your heart. So your faith has gone just beyond, in the case of God, beyond mere intellectual knowledge. It means that you're certain that his plan for your life is better than your plan. So if it's a chair analogy, you don't just say to yourself, gee, I think this chair will actually hold me. You go and you sit on it. And then that third part of faith is will. There's got to be some kind of action behind your faith. It involves attitude and emotions and behavior. So your faith should be so strong that you go ahead and you conform to God's principles. So go back to the chair analogy. You don't just sit nervously on that chair with your feet firmly on the ground, kind of jerking around, thinking this chair is going to go on me any time. You relax and you lean back. So they said, despite what the Darwinists say, there's nothing irrational about faith in God. In fact, they quote Chuck Colson. I love everything that Chuck puts out. Christian faith is not an irrational leap. Examined objectively, the claims of the Bible are rational propositions well supported by reason and evidence. So back to the Darwinists. They say it's irrational to have faith in God, but they said many people have done exactly that. They've put their faith in God after examining the claims of Christ and the evidence that they see in the world and in other people's lives. And I bet you know people like that. I do. I think also of Lee Strobel. He didn't start out a lover of Jesus. He was a pretty ornery guy. And he looked at the evidence and became a Christian. Hugh Ross, head of Reasons to Believe, did the same thing. So what are they saying here? Faith in God doesn't mean you have to disconnect your brain, right? You're not a mental midget if you believe in like intelligent design in the case of this book here. So they said there are a lot of scientists who reject, for example, macroevolution, the Darwinist view. Here's one person. He's a molecular biologist. His name is Michael Denton. He says, ultimately, the Darwinian theory of evolution is no more nor less than the greatest myth of the 20th century. Wow. Here's the director of the Zoological Museum and director of research at the National Center of Scientific Research in France, Dr. Louis Benoit. He says, evolution is a fairy tale for adults. Wow. So they said, there are plenty of scientists who are believers, right? They're not a bunch of wild-eyed, crazy, radical lunatics. They're credible scholars. They have looked at that Darwinian theory, and they see it as lacking. So, of course, the Darwinists are horrified at all of this. They're not only scientists who will reject the Darwinian macroevolution idea, but many believe in God. They said, wow, what a shock. So they have some examples here. In a book, MIT professor Alan Lightman said, contrary to popular myths, scientists appear to have the same range of attitudes about religious matters as does the general public. So they did a Gallup poll, I guess, not too long ago. Here was the result. On any given Sunday, nearly half of all PhD scientists are, you ready for this, in church. For the general public, the figure is 47%, so it's about the same. Scientists are actually publicly proclaiming their belief in God. Here's one, really a well-known scientist, Henry Schaefer. He's won all sorts of awards, been nominated for the Nobel Prize, cited as the third most quoted chemist in the world. Here's what he had to say. The significance and joy in my science comes in the occasional moments of discovering something new and saying to myself, so that's how God did it. My goal is to understand a little corner of God's plan. Here's another, Dr. Charles Towns. He teaches at UC Berkeley, won the Nobel Prize for coming up with a laser. He said, in my view, the question of origin seems to be left unanswered if we explore from a scientific view alone. Thus, I believe there's a need for some religious or metaphysical explanation. I believe in the concept of God and in his existence. So the next section of this chapter says, yes, the idea of God and thinking there's a God, that does require faith. But Darwin does too. Yeah. They said, yeah, definitely. They said, it is kind of puzzling that God doesn't write his name up in the sky and say, believe in me. But they say, God gave enough evidence to make himself known if you're really trying to find him. He didn't want us to be robots. He wanted us to make up our own minds, to give us free will. We don't have to believe in him if we don't want to. He's not going to force himself. So it said Darwinism is going to require just as much faith. And they have a quote here from a man who wrote an article for the American Zoologist magazine. He says, the basic article of faith of a gradualist approach, now that'd be Darwin, is that major morphological innovation, that's changing in the bodies, can be produced without some sort of saltation. That's the sudden appearance of a new organism. Now, that's a mouthful. But what he's saying is the idea of Darwinism, which is gradual change from one species into another, is, he calls it a basic article of faith. It's got to be believed without being seen. Well, that's the same thing as faith in God, isn't it? So Darwinists criticize the intelligent design people for being unscientific. It's just based on something that's unobservable. But Darwinism also appeals to unobservables. Here's somebody else who says, in evolutionary science, you have all kinds of unobservables. The transitional life forms that occupy the branching points on Darwin's tree of life have never been observed in the rock record. They've been just postulated. Why? Because they help Darwinists explain the variety of life forms that we see today. So then they say, all right, so both of them require elements of faith, right? Do you want to just call it a draw? And they said, well, okay, but let's go beyond that. Is Darwinism, does it require a small step of faith or a gigantic leap of faith? And the same thing with intelligent design. Does it require a small step of faith or a gigantic leap of one? So they said, let's go through the evidence that they've been covering in this book for an intelligent designer. The Big Bang, the fine-tuned universe, the origin of life and human life. And they show you, for example, the odds against the universe being tuned this way are enormous. Darwinism doesn't offer a legitimate explanation for how life came out of non-life. There's no support for the idea that humans descended from an ancestor of the apes. So they said, look at that. Does intelligent design require a small step of faith or a gigantic leap? Well, I would say it's a small step, but some may disagree. But I think from the Christian perspective, that's a small step of faith. And then they say, okay, let's go to Darwinism. Does that require a small step of faith? Or does that require a gigantic leap? So they say, let's look at the fossil record. Darwin said we would eventually find all these transitional animals and all. Said just the opposite has happened. The fossil record seems to disprove the Darwinian theory. What about random chance? But the odds against life just appearing by chance is way worse than trying to win the lottery. Then you got the irreducible complexity. Darwin said, my theory will be in trouble if there were any organism that couldn't evolve in gradual stages. But you look at the things that Michael Behe, the biochemist, has talked about, the irreducible complexity of the human cell, and things like the bacterial flagellum, those little whip-like motors that are inside small bacteria. They have complicated, interrelated workings. They can't be reduced to a simpler stage. So they said, vote again. Darwinism, does it require a small step of faith or a gigantic leap? Well, I would say a gigantic leap. All right, so they begin to wind up the chapter here. They said, what's the real hang-up? They said, let's conclude this chapter. Let's talk to the skeptics. So they said, so if you're continuing to reject the notion that our existence is due to some kind of creative act of God, they said, we respect your right. So I like that about the book. They're very kind. They don't say, what's wrong with you? And they said, we acknowledge you're not alone. Many people doubt the existence of God. Says, we respect your analysis if you don't find the evidence to be persuasive for intelligent design. But, and I think this is really good, they say, we hope you're being honest with yourself. So it says, make one last gut check. And here it is. Is your lack of faith in God the result of objective analysis of the evidence? So you've really looked it over. You've looked at everything they've talked about so far, the start of the universe, the start of life, the fine-tuning of life, DNA, the rise of humans, things like that. So have you looked at the evidence and you've rejected it? Or is your lack of faith in God based on your fear of being accountable to him? I have seen that over and over. People that are honest enough to say, I don't want there to be a God. He says many people find excuses for refusing to believe in God. Yeah, and there are excuses. There are all sorts of problems. Evil and suffering, the idea of hell, Christ being the only way to God. Okay, so you got all those. He said there are legitimate questions there. And then they go into, later on in the book, they will deal with those questions. But they said many people still refuse to put their faith in God, even when they realize that there are answers to these objections. Yeah, there are. But it said it comes down to it, they don't want to be bothered with God in their life. So just deny his existence rather than deal with him. And as they begin to wrap up the chapter, they say your lack of faith in God is your own decision, but you owe it to yourself to make sure you realize the underlying reasons why you don't want to believe in God. Is it based on evidence or just a stubborn attitude? And they quote somebody who says, a man rejects God neither because of intellectual demands nor because of the scarcity of evidence. A man rejects God because of a moral resistance that refuses to admit his need for God. I mean, the Christian view is that we're all rebels. We've all taken on a fight against God. And it's awfully hard to lay our weapons down and say, I surrender. So toward the end of the chapter, the very end here, they call it, what's that again, ? And it's just basically a quick summary. So let me do that real quickly. So first point, faith and science are not mutually exclusive. Number 2, faith is not blind acceptance of unsubstantiated facts. It involves an informed decision based on the evidence that's there. Number 3, if you have faith in God, you're not a lunatic. Many leading scientists support intelligent design, for example, and many do believe in the God of the Bible. Number 4, Darwinists try to dismiss intelligent design theory. They call it unscientific. Why? Because it requires faith in a designer. But belief in Darwinism requires faith in theories that haven't been substantiated. 5, the evidence for God, yes, it will require a small step of faith, but they believe, and I think they're right, belief in Darwinism requires a gigantic leap of faith. Then in number 6, if you're still skeptical about God, make sure your lack of faith is based on a truly objective analysis of the evidence and not just a subconscious, stubborn desire to have life your own way. And as they wrap up the chapter, they mention some books to take a look at. Now, this book is, 10 or 15 years old, so they indicate The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, and a book that I have not read by Mark Furtado called Creation, A Witness to the Wonder of God. So I like this chapter, and I like this book, and I think it's a good challenge, but it's done in a very lighthearted, fun way. So if you know somebody that would be interested in these scientific ideas without having to plunge through calculations and fancy language and difficult terms, This would be a book to get. It's called The Guide, or just Guide to How It All Began, by Bruce Bickle, Bickel, and Stan Jantz, Jantz. Thanks so much for being part of this podcast. Take care.